There are three, maybe more, reasons why the Azov crisis erupted into a military confrontation on Sunday, 2 days ago. Firstly, that this is a product of the unfinished business of the Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in spring 2014. This issue was never really put on the table for negotiations in the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements in September 2014 and February 2015. Crimea was not mentioned. This was because Russian President Putin refused to include the Crimea in the Minsk negotiations, saying this was already a done deal. It was part of Russia. The only issue we're talking about is the Donbass. So we've had this kind of nearly 5 years of kind of a fake news, if you want to call it, where the Crimea is occupied but not really discussed. Of course, it's not recognized by the West. And Russia claiming that it's not involved in the Donbass militarily. This is just a civil war between Ukrainian fascists, nationalists, and Russian speakers. So what this shows, this Azov conflict, is that we've moved out of this fake news stage, this kind of hybridity from the little green men of 2014 into actual open physical contact. Russia was condemned by everybody in the Western world. Nobody took Russia's side. That's good, but the problem of the Crimea is far deeper than just this particular incident. There are many people in the West, including amongst many academics who teach, for example, Russian history, who believe that the Crimea is no big deal, that the Crimea was always Russian and that it was wrong to include it in Ukraine anyway, and that the so-called, titular nation, the First Nation, are really Russians. Professor Magochi did a video blog in 2014 following his book on the history of the Crimean Tatars, saying that this is absolutely not true, that the First Nations, if you want to use that term, in the Crimea are the Crimean Tatars. So we have a paradox that traditionally left liberal academics are actually supporting a far-right nationalist Trumpian, if you want to call it that, Donald Trumpian type of view of indigenous peoples. Because if you applied this same logic that they use vis-a-vis the Crimea, that somehow the history of the Crimea only began in 1783 when Russia annexed the region, there's no history prior to 1783, then if you applied that to Australia and the United States and Canada, then these three countries had no history prior to Captain Cook, Jamestown, and Quebec, which of course would be regarded as racist if we said that in any of those three countries, and you would really be scolded for it. You would be probably hounded out of your academic job for doing it. But it's tolerated within the sphere of the teaching of Russian history. And much of the writing on the Crimea since then, particularly even amongst the sort of the pro-Russian camp in the West, the pro-Putin camp, talks about the Crimea as no big deal. It's gone back to Russia. Well, so what? It was never Ukrainian. And this is even including amongst left-wing academics as well. So the Crimea, Azov is part of that problem. It's part of the unfinished business that the West really never got into in 2014, particularly at a time when Prime Minister David Cameron and President Barack Obama, in effect, betrayed Ukraine by not really fulfilling their commitments under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. And Ukraine was left stranded. I mean, President Poroshenko in 2014 was faced by Russian military aggression, and he had no army really to talk of because it had been melted down by President Yanukovych. The country was bankrupt, and thankfully Ukrainians rallied to the Ukrainian flag, patriots, Russian and Ukrainian speakers, women and men, and Ukraine was protected. but the Western governments didn't really become involved until the summer of 2014, when MH17 was shot down, and the Crimea was always a kind of a sideshow to the Donbass, not really something to discuss, particularly in the format that was there at the time. The format was Britain and the US were not involved. Again, that was wrong based on the Budapest Memorandum. They provided no support. It was France and Germany kind of representing the EU, Russia and Ukraine. And for some reason, they chose Minsk, of all places, the capital of a pro-Russian Belarus, rather than, say, neutral Switzerland. So I think the Azov is that, and the building of the bridge 6 months ago from Kerch to the Crimea obviously exacerbated that, and Russia's been using the building of that bridge to try to blockade economically, politically, and militarily southeast Ukraine around the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol. So secondly, I believe that another reason is linked to, I would call it even panic stations in Moscow, that Russia's soft power influence in Ukraine is dramatically on the decline. This is not something that's often talked about in the West. It's kind of even ignored. And that's because I don't think many people follow domestic developments in Ukraine. But in effect, what has happened in the last 4 to 5 years is that there's been a removal and undermining of Russian influence by a number of factors. It's been by Putin's military aggression turning against him in Ukraine, by conscious actions on the part of President Poroshenko, the parliament and government, and of course on the part of civil society. So it's a mixture of those three things. But to give you one example of Putin's home goal, pro-Russian forces who Putin would love to see back in power in Ukraine are impossible to come into power or even to get into the second round of presidential elections, because 16% of Ukrainian voters in 27 election districts are under Russian occupation in the Crimea and Donbass. That means that they don't really stand a chance. Coupled with that is that the Communist Party is illegal, the opposition bloc, the successor to the party regions, is very badly divided, and it probably has something like 3 presidential candidates running from it. They just split a week ago. So that means that the pro-Russian camp really is not able to put up a fight in elections. That is why Putin is desperate to bring these territories in the Donbass back into Ukraine, because for him that brings back that pro-Russian element in Ukraine. And Ukrainian leaders wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that, but of course not on Putin's terms. So I would say 2 to 3 major areas where this has really impacted on Moscow has been on, firstly, the whole process of decommunization, which was launched by the adoption of 4 laws in the spring of 2015. And these laws built on a process that had already begun by nationalist groups and civil society groups during the Euromaidan. Remember the pulling down of the Lenin monument in Kyiv in December 2013. And there was already a kind of an automatic, a sporadic pulling down of Lenin monuments in central Ukraine already in 2014, before the laws were adopted. But these laws spurred it on. These laws in turn not only take Ukraine away from the Russian identity, for example, on World War II, towards Europe, but also build on what I would say is something like over 3 decades of de-Stalinization and raising awareness of the Holodomor. A recent opinion poll this month found that 80% of Ukrainians now believe the Holodomor was a genocide. And we're talking even 2/3 of people in the East and South. So this is not something that divides the country at all. This process began in the US and Canada in 1983. I remember attending a commemoration in London in that year on the 50th anniversary. And of course, then it spread to Ukraine in the late 1980s and then to independent Ukraine in the early 1990s. So there's been a lot of work. I was just in Kiev and attended the 85th anniversary commemoration of the famine, a major symposium in Kiev. So that process has been going on anyway, and the decommunization laws were the kind of final split with Russia's interpretation of the past. A second area is and this provoked Russia to call an emergency session of its own Security Council, and that was the granting of autocephaly independence to Ukraine's Orthodox from the Russian Orthodox Church. This is in no mean terms a kind of a second collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a collapse of the Russian world, Ruski Mir. And it's on a balance similar to what happened in 1991 in the eyes of Moscow. And hence why the Russian Orthodox Church was pushed probably by Putin to do a schism and to break its relations with Constantinople, which is a major decision. Russia stands to lose all sorts of things, not only a third of its parishes in Ukraine, but also major historical and religious buildings. In Kiev and elsewhere, the biggest Russian Orthodox complex in western Ukraine is in northern Ternopil Oblast, and just this week was transferred from the Russian Orthodox Church back to the Ukrainian state. So Russia stands to lose a lot. It stands to lose also its claim to Kiev history. And again, that's important in the light of Russian nationalism in Moscow, which continues to say that Kiev is the birthplace of the Russian people. This is Putin's own words. So all of that added to other areas where relations with Russia have declined: trade, economics, gas sector, social media, TV. Russian soft power influence in Ukraine is on a dramatic slide downwards, and I don't think they know how to stop that. I mean, how do you stop that? It's a process that they themselves, the Russians themselves, began in 2014. And that's not including the massive changes in national identity in Ukraine as a consequence of bloodshed, conflict, and war. The third area is I think, Putin. There's no coincidence that this is happening just ahead of the presidential elections in March. Putin's worst potential nightmare of who would win that election is Petro Poroshenko, for the reasons I've just outlined. I mean, because he would continue what's been going on for the last 5 years, which is that de-Russianization, decommunization, de-Sovietization. For example, the president has promoted the idea of changing the Ukrainian constitution to include the goals of NATO and EU membership. There have already been 2 votes on this. One received 326 votes, one received 311. This has now gone to the Constitutional Court, and in the next parliamentary session in January, it'll be voted through. That's a constitutional majority already, even before it's needed, because in the first vote, you only need a simple majority. Second vote, you needed 300 votes. So that shows you again the kind of mood of change in the Ukrainian parliament. So the last person that Putin would like to see elected would be Poroshenko, because he knows what he's going to get. He's going to get the same as what he's seen the last 4 or 5 years. So then I think he's trying to undermine Poroshenko's election chances by creating this kind of crisis. Of course, he'll do the opposite. As always, Russia scores many home goals, as we know from the interference in the US elections, interference in Britain, Brexit, the chemical poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Britain, and Ukrainian developments. So I don't think that Russia will be successful necessarily in undermining Poroshenko. If anything, Ukrainians are very patriotic and will rally around the flag. But that certainly is a sign of desperation and a sign of an attempt by Moscow to do something to change the outcome of the elections. It's going to be very difficult for Putin to do that, because the pro-Russian candidates, as I've already mentioned, like Yuri Boyko, simply don't have a chance of coming to power, never mind getting into the second round, because they don't have the votes. And martial law, if it's continued after December, is actually taking place in eastern and southern Ukraine. So who else is potentially a favorite in Moscow? Well, if you look at the Ukrainian opinion poll about 2 months ago, it asked Ukrainians who did they think Moscow would like to see best elected in Ukraine. And they said, firstly, Yuri Boyko, secondly, Vadim Rabinovich, both from the opposition bloc, and thirdly, Yulia Tymoshenko. Yulia Tymoshenko, whether it's true or not, has an image problem vis-a-vis Russia. Even BBC Hard Talk presenter Stephen Sacco asked her this question at a conference I attended in September in Kyiv, the Gold European Strategy Conference, and he asked this in front of a huge crowd, that, you know, you have this problem, this image problem with Russia. You have a problem that you seem to be somebody that Putin thinks he can do a deal with. Certainly, this problem of anti-war populism, as I call it, is very prevalent in the elections. When you take the taxi from Borispil Airport to the center of Kiev, the whole motorway is full of election placards, and everybody's promising peace. How they will achieve peace, nobody says, because, and of course they can't, because the only person that can bring peace is Vladimir Putin. He began the war. He is the only person that can end it. Any Ukrainian who says that they can end the war is lying, or is willing to capitulate to Putin's demands. It's as simple as that. Because how are you going to negotiate a deal with Putin? He's not likely to come to some sort of compromise with you. So again, that's something that's going to come up in the elections. But you know, we're at the kind of pre-election stage yet, where nobody is really asking these candidates, okay, you say you can bring peace, how? When it comes to debates and such like, then they'll be put on the spot. And I don't think that they'll have many answers to that. So I think that it's an attempt to maybe swing the elections away from Poroshenko, maybe to Tymoshenko. I don't think that will necessarily work. But I think that they're desperate. They don't really have many options left in how they can influence Ukraine. And this is one of them. So I think it's a combination of many different factors. It's a combination of unfinished business. The West never really had its eye on the ball in the Crimean question, and many people in the West have a viewpoint that, it's Russian anyway, what's the big deal, which is not the same as how they view Eastern Ukraine. And this view is very much perpetuated inside Russia, where even the Russian opposition, 90% of the Russian opposition support the annexation of the Crimea, Alexei Navalny, for example. And secondly, it's panic about declining Russian soft power influence, and thirdly, an attempt to sort of intervene somehow in the elections and particularly hurt President Petro Poroshenko. So I don't think any of these factors will necessarily work. I think that they'll rebound against Russia again. Russia is always heavy-handed and always scores home goals. It's always done this in the Ukrainian case. It's nothing new. It's not even a Putin problem. It's a Russian problem. In 1994, Leonid Kuchma was elected on a moderate pro-Russian platform in opposition to so-called nationalist Leonid Kravchuk. He thought that being from eastern Ukraine, that Yeltsin would come immediately to Kiev, they'd sign an interstate treaty, and brotherly relations, as they call it, would blossom. That didn't happen. Yeltsin didn't arrive till May 1997. And Kuchma got so fed up with waiting for the Russians that he turned to the West, established good, cordial relations with Bill Clinton, president of the US, and adopted a more pro-NATO posture. So Russia's been doing this all along. It always, through its arrogance and chauvinism, turns even its own allies away from itself. And therefore, I think the same thing will happen here. Its policies on the Azov will not necessarily work to the advantage that Russia thinks it would like to achieve. But the people in Moscow, including President Putin, are angry. They're angry with the Ukraine, and they're angry with the West. And let's not forget, they have a very warped view of what is Ukraine. For them, Ukraine is just a non-existent, really, state that is a Western puppet. And that's how they see Ukraine. They see Ukraine as Russian, that really should belong to them. And the only reason it's not belonging to them is because the West has puppets in power in Ukraine. Of course, that's not true. Ukrainian patriotism is very alive and well, but they just don't get that in Moscow. So, on a final note, we should not think this is going to go away for all sorts of reasons. Firstly, Putin is president until 2024, so that's at least another 6 years. Secondly, in my view, President Putin is president for life, so he'll be there even after 2024. In Russia's criminal authoritarian system, you can't leave office. If you leave office, you'll be killed or be put in jail. And you'll certainly lose all your wealth. So he can't leave office, whether he likes it or not. And that's true throughout that region of the world. You know, Central Asia, Lukashenko and Belarus, Azerbaijan, it's all the same. Thirdly, even if he fell off his horse when he was riding it without his shirt, or he died fighting a tiger, you know, it's unlikely because he always wins, then there are many more Putins in Moscow. Putin isn't somehow unique in his antagonism towards Ukraine. And that Russian chauvinism that he propagates is alive and well amongst a broad swathe of that militocratic regime that draws its inspiration from former Soviet intelligence and military officers. So Putin isn't the issue. It's a more deeper issue. So therefore, I think this problem, shall we say, this type of crisis is going to be around with us for quite a while yet, and could potentially get worse. On that note, I'll leave it. Thank you very much.